logic and Freemasonry. So to start out, what is logic? And I will add a disclaimer: I'm not actually a Star Trek fan. Um, I am more of a Star Wars guy, but just the idea of Spock as always saying something's illogical. So I thought that would make a good hastily photoshopped image for this meeting. And actually, to back up a little bit, I got interested in this topic, at least in terms of Masonry, when I gave a presentation about the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And as people who are Masons know, well, actually, anybody who knows anything about the 7 liberal arts and science, because it's not a Masonic secret, but one of them is logic. And so going through all that, I kind of had flashbacks to college when I majored in philosophy. And, I took a wide range of classes from epistemology, American pragmatism, to the philosophy of Asian martial arts, and then logic and deductive reasoning. And what was interesting about the logic class is I took one that was symbolic logic, and it was required class for both philosophy majors and computer scientists. So it was an interesting mix and really dealt with the idea of how to break down arguments logically. So, as I mentioned, I had my extremely useful philosophy degree, and then several years later, I did end up getting a computer science degree. So maybe some of that logic stuck. So doing this research in this for this presentation for the seven liberal arts and sciences, I was kind of reminded of, there's really, in all of these, because they're all major subjects, but there's a lot of really interesting things within logic that people tend not to spend a lot of time thinking about. Even some of the symbolic logic can be interesting. Everybody loves talking about logical fallacies. So I really thought it'd be interesting to make a presentation discussing these sorts of aspects of it. So I mentioned this in an officers meeting, at which point Brother Joel Nathan mentioned, 4 years ago, I wrote a series of articles for our Trestle board on logic. So I said, it'd be even better than sending me those articles, Brother Joel, is if you would be so kind as to present about it. But he kindly demurred. So I said, all right, well, send me your presentations, and I'll go with that. And I started working through Joel's presentation to get the basics of logic, which was these are extremely well written articles to kind of explain the building blocks of logic. And I wanted to focus a bit on some of the logical fallacies. And then in looking up some of the logical fallacies, I found one of my old textbooks that had a really more about how to have, the book is called Attacking Faulty Reasoning, but it has more information about really what the entire point of having, an argument, but an actual argument with using logic as a debate. So this thing kind of morphed and grew into wide spanning conversation, I guess is what we'll call it. So to start off, what is logic? And logic is based on arguments, and it's the study of reasoning. And reasoning itself is the process by which we try to discover the truth. So we have this idea of the truth, and it's extremely interesting in Masonry because we talk about using blocks. Each person is kind of a metaphorical block to build a bigger thing, whether it's a building or generally building. But the idea of it's composed of several parts that bring you to this large idea. And that's kind of the same thing with logic. Logic is a series of arguments, each one of which is a block that you follow and build on each other to finally get to the conclusion, and you get the whole reasoning, the whole argument, and that's kind of what logic is. That's where the truth is. And so arguments themselves are a sequence of declarative sentences. So you're basically saying A is whatever. And it's a lot like in geometry having to do proofs where you have this series of statements, and there's different logical rules that you can use to say this statement is valid. It's a it makes sense that you're saying if everything in a group has this property, this thing is in a group, then it follows that this thing has that property. So it's these sorts of statements and building blocks that are really that form the entire core of logic. So the last sentence in an argument is going to be your conclusion, but everything else leading up to it are the premises, and each one of them is a bit of evidence, a building block that basically gives you this whole object, which is your argument, or and if it was building blocks, the building itself. So an interesting thing about logic is it's we're interested in finding the truth, but it's not completely concerned with the truth. It's based on creating sound arguments. So an argument is sound if the premises are true and its reasoning is valid, if everything checks out. And those are the only kind of arguments that actually prove their conclusions. If you're coming to a conclusion at the end of an argument, you have to have true premises, and your entire argument, this entire building, has to be sound. If it's not, your argument is unsound and it doesn't hold up, right? Just like a building. And so it doesn't fail or it fails to prove its conclusion, and therefore isn't really useful as a structure. So logic itself is concerned with how valid your reasoning is, whether each series of premises follow from each other, whether each statement makes sense, and then whether you can actually logically connect each one of the statements to get to this conclusion. So you're again not necessarily focusing on how true the premises are. You're focusing on whether it makes sense that these premises can follow. And then reasoning, we had mentioned that there's the process of reasoning, and there's two different ways you can reason, two different directions. We're primarily going to be talking about deductive reasoning, which, like a pyramid, if you start at the bottom here, you're taking extremely general rules and you kind of keep shrinking the what you're talking about, the body of evidence that you have, and as you keep kind of shrinking each of these rules, you get to the point, the top of it, which is going to be the conclusion. And of course I had to pick a pyramid for this as well. So in masonry, all of your arguments, they're starting broader. You have your wider base, and then you start to narrow it down as you kind of refine your argument and finally reach the peak, the conclusion. And then inductive reasoning, it's almost the opposite, where starting at the bottom here, where you have your very specific case, and then you use this specific case to kind of generalize out of saying, well, in this instance it's true, so what it's almost like what if. So what if this series of instances happen, would that still be true? And if you can agree on that, then you kind of keep moving up until you get this inverted pyramid. So we're primarily going to be talking about some of the deductive reasoning, but a lot of the principles still apply for inductive reasoning. And so winning an argument, it's the headlining, of course, is misleading, because traditionally, to disprove the validity of an argument, you come up with a counterexample. If you read a lot of the Socratic dialogues, it's a discussion between two people taking place as an argument, and what they're trying to do is either the people that Socrates is arguing with, or Socrates himself, they both come up with counterexamples of, well, so let's suppose that this were the case, would that still follow? And the point is, you just have to be able to think of a counterexample. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, but if you can envision a world where this counterexample happens, then the argument isn't necessarily valid. So, a lot of times people focus on the premises about whether this is true, whether it's a logical fallacy, but um, kind of the best way to question the validity of an argument is with a strong counterexample. So, we talked about building blocks. So, I kind of wanted to step back to some of the more, I guess, symbolic aspects of logic. And Aristotle, who we talk about a lot in the liberal arts and sciences, and even the Masonic virtues, or the cardinal, and I gave a presentation on that too. And I'm blanking on, and theological virtues. Um, you have these syllogisms, these really brief, like three-part arguments. So you have all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And it's a really self-contained argument. You have your all men are mortal is a premise, Socrates is a man is a premise. And then if you accept the truth of the first sentence, you accept the truth of the second sentence, the third one follows from accepting those two premises. So that's the evidence that this last line, this conclusion, is true. So if you understand, if you agree with the premises, then you kind of like, there's really no way around it. You have to agree with the conclusion. And what's interesting about logic itself is that a lot of the time you can actually convert this to more symbolic logic. And this was something that I did a little bit in this computer science logic class as well. Is you take an argument like this and you replace things with variables. So it almost turns into math, where all A or B, C is A, therefore C is B. So you have, and these are actual, like, each one of these statements are a specific logical rule. So you would say, just like a geometric proof, all A or B, that would be a specific logical rule. C is A, that would be another logical rule. And then using those two rules, you'd be able to prove that therefore C is B. And so that's kind of what another strength of logic is, that it's you could actually strip away the actual words that are the premises, replace them with a variable, and really spend more time deducing what the argument itself is, without getting hung up on specific premises, without a lot of heated debate about one thing or another. This kind of really helps you to distill the argument into a really basic form. And it's interesting to be able to do that, and almost strip out some of the emotions that tend to cloud people's judgment in arguments. And then there's a couple other syllogisms, or the two big ones, modus ponens, and then the next one is modus tollens. And these are also deductive rules or logical rules that are usually used to kind of help establish premises. So taking our previous example, what modus ponens is if P then Q, P, so you state that P exists, therefore Q. And I mean, it's basic. You're not winning complex arguments with this, but it's the building blocks. It's the basic ways of being able to say, all right, so if Socrates is a man, then he is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And this is laying the groundwork. This is so that throughout the argument you don't have to keep proving that Socrates is mortal. You don't have to keep going through this argument every time you discuss the mortality of Socrates. So it's it's establishing your variables ahead of time. It's kind of doing some of the condensing and cleanup before you start building your main argument. very similar one is called modus tollens, which is a negation. So if P then Q, not Q, so Q doesn't exist, or you don't affirm Q, therefore not P. And that's kind of a causal relationship, the if then statement. So, if a being is a man, then they are mortal. Socrates is immortal, which is, the not Q, therefore Socrates is not a man. And, again, logically, this follows. It's just, you have a problem with this one premise that doesn't make sense. But the argument itself is valid. It's just one of the premises that doesn't make sense. And that's kind of where you would focus your attention on in a debate or in an argument, using the actual classical sense of argument. So everybody's favorite part, the logical fallacies. It's you hear a lot of these phrases and these words thrown about, and I'm gonna focus on the 5 main ones that Brother Joel had talked about. They tend to be the most common, but I mean, there's, I'm looking at a stack of books on my desk that have just a series of different logical fallacies about them. So, we have the ad hominem fallacy, which is an attack on the person rather than the person's argument. And, another reason that I thought it would be good to talk about this, this subject is, we have our first presidential debate tomorrow. And, it fits that around this time 4 years ago, Brother Joel was also writing about logic. So to be able to really focus on the argument itself and the idea that a person's character doesn't necessarily doesn't weaken their argument. It could weaken yours if you don't have anything better to discuss, but it's really just more important to almost ignore the personality and just focus on what the argument is, what the premises are, what the conclusion is, and how that's they can follow. So as a more since we don't talk politics or religion and masonry, baseball's safer, right? Again, I'm also not a baseball person. I'm using Brother Joel's examples. But
Let me just
so
add here. Can I just
yep,
add something here? That maybe Fred is a Yankee fan, and that doesn't disqualify him for his opinion that Joe DiMaggio was the greatest hitter. But in fact, we all know that he wasn't the greatest hitter. And in fact, the greatest hitter of all time was Ted Williams, who coincidentally, 60 years ago today, was his last game. And in his very last at bat, he hit a home run to put an
I saw
exclamation point on his claim to being the greatest hitter ever. And I'm not going to
I,
say anything more.
I saw you had shared that. He also liked Moxie, so that's win-win right there.
What about Pete
So
Rose?
I don't follow baseball, so um so again, like Brother Joel mentioned, an example of the ad hominem is Fred thinks Joe DiMaggio was the greatest hitter, but Fred is a Yankee fan, so he can't be objective. This is really, this attack on Fred isn't doing anything about what Fred's argument, what his discussion actually is, that Fred is making an argument that Joe DiMaggio was the greatest hitter. So, it's kind of, a fairly weak way of arguing when you're focusing on the person rather than the actual argument. So another common fallacy is begging the question. So that's when you have your argument in a way that's very leading. So the premise and the conclusion say the same thing. So David Ortiz is the greatest designated hitter ever to play the game because there hasn't been anyone else as good. You're basically saying it's a tautology. You're saying he's the greatest designated hitter because he's the greatest designated hitter, and logically that's valid. It's not an argument though. It's just saying, you know, A is A, and that's not an extremely useful statement. You can't really do much with it. But if you're trying to use it to not have debate or argument, then you know that's kind of again a fallacy and pretty weak logic. False dichotomy is another one. So, which is, you know, so it's the assumption that there's only two possible solutions. You know, this whole like everything's black and white kind of idea, and you kind of really you do see it a lot within arguments where you know it's either this or that, and you know you're not going to let it be this idea. So, you know, you kind of structure your arguments in that way. So, you know, if you prove that the other person's argument is true, then that doesn't prove that your argument is true. That's just, you know, you're just disproving the other argument. So there are other possibilities that could be in play. You're just assuming that it's either this or the other one. So the example, David Ortiz can't play first base anymore, therefore the Red Sox should designate him for assignment. You know, there's a whole slew of different possibilities. He could be the mascot and run around the stadium, or he could be an umpire. You know, there's he could mow the grass. There's a whole lot of other options for this guy. And you know, just because he can't play first base anymore, you know, doesn't mean that your option is the correct one. And then you know, hasty generalization, that's using too small of a sample size to make this generalization. So you know, you're not really gaining a representative sample. You'll see surveys and it might be like 10 people. It's like, well, you know, that's not, yes, that is a survey, but it's not necessarily a useful sample size. I mean, sometimes it could be all you need, but you know, you're using it to just make a generalization. So, example: Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, and Mickey Mantle were all great hitters. Therefore, all great hitters were Yankees. So, you know, I at least grew up during the Cal Ripken golden years. So, you know, you have to. Oh, he just played a lot of games. He just got the attendance award, right? But you know, of not actually, you know, you kind of have your blinders on. You're basically just picking what you need to prove your argument, and you're ignoring an entire range of other possibilities. Which, you know, so that's going to be a you know, logical fallacy. And finally, we have the straw man. So that's when you focus on just a small part of the argument, and but you know, treat it as though it's like the main crux of the issue. So in the example, Ted Williams is not the greatest hitter of all time because he only batted 200 in the World Series. That's taking this one event, this one statement, and trying to use it to disprove, you know, this entire argument. And so doing that, you're kind of you're ignoring all of the other evidence, and you're really just focusing on this one thing, which you know, doesn't disprove all of it, because the entire point of an argument is you have a series of premises of evidence that you have. So you know, I'm sure actually building inspector would can a project if you had 1 weak stone in it, but that you know, 1 weak stone could be reinforced, or it could be, you know, there could be other evidence that can help support it. You know, it could just be a display stone. You know, it doesn't have any structural function. So you know, there's a lot of different things that could be focused on an argument instead of just this one weak spot. So, you know, applying all this logic, and this is actually kind of what I got interested, I guess, really a couple days ago when I finally sat down to make this presentation. And you know, I picked up this old logic book I have. I'm actually going to hold it up to the camera here, and it's called Attacking Faulty Reasoning. And I knew this one had a pretty authoritative list of fallacies in it. And it's got fallacies, it's got, you know, examples of them, and then it's also got it says, attacking the fallacy, but what, if you are in an argument and someone, because it's not enough to say, no, that's a logical fallacy and throw it out. It's like, I use box too. So, if someone throws a punch and you slip it, it's not enough to say, oh, that was a bad punch, because that doesn't help you. What you want to do is you want to be able to slip it and have a counter. So, being able to recognize them, yeah, that's extremely useful. But unless you can use it as leverage or use that to your favor to help either disprove the validity of the argument or strengthen yours, then it's not too helpful to just point them out. So in this book, Attacking Faulty Reasoning, pretty early on, there's something listed called a code of conduct for effective rational discussion. And it actually really just like swerved me over to kind of want to focus a bit on this. And there's, I think, like 12 of these specific points. So I'll try to go through them a little quicker. And so there's like the fallibility principle. So yes, you may be arguing with someone, but yeah, it's kind of like the which one? The false dichotomy argument. You have to go into an argument knowing that you may be wrong. You don't. I mean, you're going to go in assuming you're right, but there is the possibility that your argument may be wrong, and that it is possible that none of them are any good. So it is possible going into this that you're fallible, and that's actually. As I read a lot of these, you do kind of think about it in today's discourse that nobody goes into anything assuming well, or with the possibility that they could be wrong, and a lot of these too. Reading through these, we talk in Masonry about using these ideas to improve yourself. So this is kind of like another. Reading this, it's like, okay, well, I'm married, so you do have to go in sometimes, and realize that you could have been wrong about something. And so, having this sort of awareness, I think can really just help you in everyday life. There's the truth-seeking principle, and again, it's pretty similar to the fallibility in that you're going into an argument, a discussion, and you should actually be seeking truth. You shouldn't be just like arguing for the sake of arguing or arguing for the sake of disproving. You want to actually do something with this. You don't want to argue just for the sake of argument. You want to be able to learn something or teach someone. So it's and to do that, you actually do have to listen to what your opponent is saying and actually understand it and look at it. So again, it is kind of stripping out some of the emotion that gets attached to things and really helps you within discussions and arguments to have them logically. The clarity principle. So you don't want to be confusing about anything. You don't want to use like weasel words that kind of help like lead people or have loaded meanings. And this because I just copied and pasted these from another website that cited the book, so I kept a few of the asides. So if you're not clear on your arguments, then you're not really you're doing a disservice to so this was a debate coach, so they're talking about the audience, but even to your opponent. And really, if you can't state your argument clearly, you kind of probably have no position debating it. And that kind of goes back to the fallibility of you might not have wanted to step into that one. There's the burden of proof principle. So if you're setting forth a position, the burden of proof is on you. And you'll see that one kind of sometimes popping up on Facebook in heated comment sections. But if an opponent asks for proof, you supply the proof. That's kind of just how it goes if you're making assertions about something. There's the principle of charity. So if you are going to reiterate somebody's argument or restate the argument, if they give you this beautifully crafted Olaf cake, you don't want to give them this thing and say, yeah, nailed it, that's your argument. Look how terrible it is. So you owe it to the person that you are having a debate with to deliver their argument, or to redeliver their argument as strongly as they delivered it to you. And again, so this was one of the asides, is that by not being charitable, you're setting up a straw man, because you say, oh well, look, these Oreo cookies or something that are making as buttons, those are terrible, so you did a terrible job with the cake. I mean, the entire cake is terrible, but you're mainly just focusing on that, and that's not a useful. The cake probably still would taste pretty good, but it's not useful in an actual like debate that is designed to seek the truth. There's the relevance principle, and so these next couple, they have the asterisk, because this is where the majority of the logical fallacies come in. So if you're presenting an argument for something, then your reasons, your premises should be relevant to that argument. If you're throwing in asides or using things that aren't relevant, then that's a weak way to go about formulating an argument. And then one of the asides was you can shift the goalpost, which is say, no, I didn't mean that, I meant this, or really it should be this, and it keeps you from actually having to have a position. And really doesn't make for a good argument. So if you're just using common opinion, no, everybody thinks this, or you should be ashamed to suggest this, those are not really relevant to an argument itself. It's kind of very misleading. And there's the acceptability principle, and this picture probably should have gone for clarity as well, but put it here too. And so you should actually, if you're formulating arguments, your reasons, your evidence need to be acceptable, and that they meet what is acceptable. So it's almost like you agree on sources ahead of time, and you agree on what the limits of the argument is. So some of the common fallacies based with that are begging the question. So you could use an improper accent. So you focus on the wrong part of somebody's argument, you take it out of context, or you use false alternatives, and that's the false dichotomy fallacy we talked about earlier, because you're not using what was previously agreed upon as almost like the terms of the argument. There's a sufficiency principle, which if you're providing reasons that are sufficient number and kind and weight to support the acceptance of the conclusion. So this kind of goes to are a little bit of the straw man too. You're arguing from ignorance. You haven't actually spent time to learn everything. You're missing evidence. That's our hasty generalization sample. You're not doing your research. You aren't informed about the topic you're trying to argue about. There's some causal fallacies, the post hoc fallacy. That's that whole like causation or correlation does not equal causation, where you can chart two completely unrelated things. I have a colleague who in one of his slide decks always has this graph that the birth rate in Romania, where he grew up, is directly related to the number of storks that were seen in the area. So you have this like idea that just because they're correlated doesn't mean they actually cause each other. You also have the gambler's fallacy of just because an event that happened in the past doesn't necessarily have an impact in the future, especially for something with chance. You got your Monte Carlo roulette wheel where it keeps coming up on black. each spin, there's still, it's not 50-50 because you got the green ones, but it's still the exact same probability, even though, you know, it may have hit black 20 times in a row, there's still the exact same probability that the next one's going to be black. And, you know, people wiped out their savings betting on red because they felt that it was due to come up anytime. So, you know, a lot of things like that of actually, if you're trying to discuss causality, what the actual causes of something are, you need to make sure that they actually do have causality. There's the rebuttal principle. So if you're presenting an argument for or against their position, it's beneficial for you to actually present the rebuttal that as you're presenting your argument. So if you're able to refute any counter arguments or any arguments to the contrary, then, you know, that's obviously giving a strong position. And then also it makes sure that as your opponent is offering rebuttals and challenges, that you're also seriously considering those as well. But then some of the fallacies associated with that, you know, we have ad hominem we talked about of attacking the person. There's poisoning the well of, you know, it came from here, so your entire argument's done, when in reality it might just be one premise that you would have to take out. There's diversion, so our straw man, trivial objections, red herrings, you know, focusing on something else. I put in diversionary humor because that's, you know, as people probably noticed even during this presentation, that, you know, being able to throw in quick jokes can be a defense, because, you know, if you can make people laugh, that especially if it's in like an audience debate setting, it can kind of shift towards you. You know, one example I read about some of the interesting things that had happened in presidential debates, which, I mean, really the first ones weren't held until TV anyway, with Kennedy and Nixon, and then even then they were still kind of sporadic. But you know, it was Ronald Reagan debating Walter Mondale, and the question was essentially about Ronald Reagan's age. And, you know, his response was, well, you know, I won't let the youth and inexperience of Mr. Mondale, I won't hold the youth and inexperience of Mr. Mondale against him, which, you know, got some laughs, but didn't actually answer the question that was put to him. So, you know, diversionary humor, it's, you know, fun, but you have to actually be able to then follow it up. So, you know, within this book of you know, attacking faulty reasoning, you know, that's where you would, you know, you could have some humor of your own, but then you still want to go back and circle back around and kind of press that that question. So same with a lot of these diversions, is you want to make sure that you know, your rebuttals are for the argument, not for these diversions. The resolution principle. So it's resolved if the alternate positions defend a position. And so this is a pretty long sentence to condense. So you know, really it's you accept the successful argument to be settled. So if you haven't quite, if your side, you know, doesn't have as much evidence, doesn't have as much weight to it, then you know, it leans more towards the successful argument, not necessarily yours. So, you know, if one completely proves their point and disproves the other one, then you know, it makes sense that it's resolved. But you know, sometimes you just have to go with the argument that has the strongest body of evidence associated with it. And you know, this was an aside that I added to a separate slide, mainly because both of those were pretty big. But you know, I thought it was interesting that many people who talk about rhetoric, and we'll actually get into that in a little bit too, is, you know, they won't do that. So, you know, you can provide all the sources, and, you know, there'll be something wrong with it. They won't accept the sources, or, you know, no matter how, you know, you could have their mother saying, you know, no, you're this, but they, you know, still won't accept it. And that's going to be, you know, someone that you aren't, they're not actually trying to get truth. They're not going into this argument honestly. And I thought it was interesting, this line, but they are fewer and thinner on the ground than you might expect from the internet or the media. which highlights the absurd, dramatic, and the exceptional. But this was 2009, and things have changed a little bit since then. But it does have this glimmer of hope if most people are honest enough to admit they are wrong when they have been shown to be. And that's important. That's an important characteristic as a person to have. Regardless of whether you are a debater or whether it's just within your everyday life, that you got to admit when you're wrong. It's just how things are. It's not weakness to admit that you're wrong. It's actually helps you as a person grow and become better. And then I think we're getting close to the end of these, but there's the suspension of judgment. So kind of like the resolution, if you've both done a terrible job of supporting your arguments, then you can't declare a winner. You have a stalemate, and people want this arguments to be resolved. So it is sometimes hard for people, and they'll kind of like keep pushing at it. But really, if you can't either defend it successfully or everybody defends it equally, then you can't really make a judgment on this. So and then there's the reconsideration principle. So again, if you can almost get a redo. Again, this one probably should have been up with the truth one, but I kind of like the X-Files picture better. But that if yes, you have a successful argument, but then a week later someone comes back with different evidence that can change it, you are kind of obligated to examine this new evidence, because it could change the argument, the resolution, and it's kind of that honest truth seeking more than the idea of winning a debate. So kind of starting to wrap up, we talk about how it's actually, I rearranged a few slides. This goes back with the trivium, so maybe I'll just skip this one. So how does logic itself tie in with Freemasonry? We've talked about how it's one of the lessons we learn based on the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and the first part of that is called the trivium. And these slides I just lifted from the old presentation because I had already made them, but you have this idea that grammar, logic, and rhetoric are all kind of the foundation of knowledge, and they or are part of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. What's interesting is that the quadrivium, let's see, I was focusing on logic, but arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry. Those were actually the 4 that were condensed and put together first as a quadrivium. And then later on, the trivium is kind of like these 3 building blocks were focused on in like a liberal arts education. So to quickly reiterate, grammar is the rules governing the composition of clauses, phrases, and words. So I've got diagram sentences, but what's interesting about grammar is you learn it from other people. So it's information about language, but it's how we define the objects and information perceived by the 5 sentences. But it's important that you have this grammatical structure to be able to formulate arguments. If your grammar is terrible, then it's really hard to argue, and that's part of the clarity principle. You've got rhetoric, so that's how you apply language to instruct and persuade the listener and the reader. And it's so Aristotle said it's the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So it's reading a crowd, right? It's knowing. It's actually kind of using more logical fallacies because you're playing to the crowd instead of to the argument. But it's being persuasive, not necessarily in search of the truth. So you have Aristotle lists 3 appeals: logos, pathos, and ethos. So the words you're using, your pathos, how you, I forget what that one was, so I'm not gonna lie. And ethos, your thoughts and your emotions behind it. And by using these three ways of reading the audience, you can help persuade groups. And then in Rome, you had invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, which was kind of how you go about rhetoric. And then so finally, logic itself is these mechanics. It's kind of taking the grammar and the persuasion of rhetoric, and it's making the triangle. So it's the final point, and it's how you identify the fallacious arguments and statements and produce factual knowledge that can be trusted. So you talk about inference, and then analyzing arguments. So you have your different variables, constants, and some of these are basically how symbolic logic, when you go through and strip out the actual like sentences and meanings of you just replace them with variables and constants and these symbols to make these arguments. So with this trivium, you have grammar is the thing as it is symbolized, logic is the thing as it is known, so how you know your truth, and then rhetoric is how you communicate it. So you have the symbolism for grammar, knowledge for logic, and communication for rhetoric. And that was Sister Miriam Joseph, who talked a lot about the trivium in liberal arts education. So it's really, logic is really how you understand knowledge from grammar, and then you can use that to transmit wisdom. So I'm going to back up to the slide that I should have moved. So, grammar teaches us to speak clearly and concisely, and then we use conceiving, judging, reasoning, and disposing of questions, of asking, and logic trains the mind to think clearly. So, your sincerity and your plain dealing using logic should distinguish Masons. So we start to see actions that may help one person, may not help all. So you kind of see things in a bigger picture, and you learn to avoid arguments just that something is true or false simply by who says it, and are focused more on gaining truth out of it. And then rhetoric is useful to be able to within a lodge to get brethren to be involved with the lodge, or to help with events or various things like that within a lodge. So it's makes sense that learning about all three of these things are also useful within besides regular life of within a lodge setting. So jumping forward again, and I promise I'm almost done, because I've been working on this, the ideas for the next three slides, because I always have this question with a lot of these presentations, lists of famous Masons, or here's 7 liberal arts and sciences, here's virtues, here's architecture. But why is that important to Masonry? We have it's a fraternity that uses like architecture and architectural tools as symbolism, and uses a metaphor of King Solomon's temple and how it relates to a supreme architect of the universe. So it's kind of, how do you take architecture and it's pretty easy to make a straight line from architecture to King Solomon's temple, and then symbols to the supreme architecture. But all of these things that we talk about in Masonry, all of these lessons that we have, why do those show up? And so within the Age of Enlightenment, that's kind of when people started looking at Renaissance ideas and back to classical Greek and Roman ideas, and a lot of these thoughts, these modes of education kind of started to become prevalent again, and that's around the same time that Masonry was getting into its present form of focusing on self-improvement. So you can really take all of these ideas as different ways to connect a person, a brother, with this idea of King Solomon's and the supreme architect of the universe. But in reality, what it's really focusing on is you have this soul and mind duality. So you know, a lot of the presentations we've been seeing have been focusing on some of the esoteric ideas of Masonry about more of a plan within the Supreme Architect of the Universe, how Masonic lessons have really deep symbolism hidden in there, and how being aware of that can kind of help transition you and your soul to that realm. But it's important as well that you're also thinking about your mind, and you know, using this education of liberal arts and sciences, of interest in architecture, um, you know, various symbols and what they mean, and things like logic. So, you know, we use this education to improve our minds, and then our souls by example and emulation. So by actually following these rules that we set out, and then that's kind of where some of these more esoteric topics can come in too, of um, of helping connect the soul to this supreme architect of the universe idea. And I really think that's kind of what both of these ideas are getting at. And but it is, you know, a duality. You kind of need to focus on both. And then within the second degree itself, which is when we talk about the liberal arts and sciences. And, you know, so we define it's a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. But the first degree, the initiation, is focused on purification, of removing some of these rough edges. And then the second degree is about illumination, about getting this knowledge. And this is really where there's a lot of the focus on these lessons of the liberal arts and sciences and orders of architecture, and then setting up this work in your mind. This education sets you up for the transformation that happens in the third degree, and then even in subsequent degrees if you join collateral bodies. So, you know, the takeaways: Masonic education improves the mind. It uses classical's ideals that experience resurgence during the Age of Enlightenment. More particularly, logic itself helps us to assess arguments and discussions kind of without this heated emotion, and recognize valid and sound arguments. And then, you know, it's important that you can recognize and call out fallacies, but, you know, you need to be able to counter these fallacies if you're really interested in having an argument that's focused on learning the truth. So that's all I got for tonight. If you have any questions on Facebook, you know, you can use the chat to ask them. You can reach out to us for education at silverspring215.org if you're interested in hearing about any of the presentations that we have. We've got a YouTube channel as well. So, you know, we're working on putting this information out for really anybody to be able to use. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and, well, you can unmute yourself. So if anybody in the GoToMeeting has any questions, feel free to chime in, and I'll scroll through and read through some of the comments as well, and address any that I may see.
Great job, brother.
Thank you, Justin.
We had a lot of internet issues trying to get.
Yeah, I think if you're live, you're gonna have to like plug directly into the router. Looks like we are having some baseball talk in the chat, so that's good.
Thank you, brother Tim. It was good presentation. Sorry for late check-in.
Oh, no problem, brother Milos. Good to see you. Glad you caught some of it.
Good to see you as well.
Joel's asking about the false analogy fallacy, so you know, I'll go ahead and throw that hot potato back at you if you wanna talk about it, brother Joel.
Touche. I think that's one that you see a lot of, especially in social media. And basically, it's you take something that that may be happening in the present time that is viewed as bad, and then comparing it, and likening it to something, a terrible event in history, and one that you see particularly a lot of is comparing it to Nazi Germany, which I think most
Yeah.
people can agree is pretty horrible. And I know I see it on both ends of the political spectrum to suit various political points. But that's one, certainly one to look out for during this political season. But I want to make
Yeah,
one
that's
other point. I
Yep.
want to make one other point, Tim. If logic fails, there's always the baseball bat.
Exactly. That's why, I brought up the boxing metaphor too, right? You got to use what tools are available. And then so Pavan also asked for suggestions about reading about logical fallacies. I mean, if you're interested in logic, there is good old Aristotle anyway. This book though, Attacking Faulty Reasoning, it's a great book. It's short. It's an easy read, and it's just got a lot of examples and counter arguments, and it kind of goes over each of the different fallacies, and that's kind of where those benchmarks of the code of conduct for rational discussion kind of comes in. So that was a good one. Another one I have is called Critical Thinking by William Hughes. And again, it's actually a bit more about constructing argument as opposed to just what we traditionally do of finding the fallacies and calling out the fallacies. It's actually about making sure that your arguments in general don't use those. And then, if you want your computer science flashbacks, this is the Logic and Philosophy, where I don't know how well anybody can see the camera on my laptop, but I'll hold it up there. But this is where you get your symbolic logic, where everything's just turned into dots and slashes and horseshoes and variables. So these were all really good ones to be able to read. And I thought I had one other one I was going to mention, but
Tim,
can't remember.
I
Yep.
have a couple of books from back when I was in college. They're probably out of print. I think the best one I have is called Logic Techniques of Formal Reasoning by Kalish and Montague. They're professors at UCLA, and it's pretty comprehensive if you're really interested in the subject. There may be later editions of the book, but I took this class 50 years ago. So,
Well, logic hasn't changed since Aristotle
no,
wrote
but
it.
I'm saying the
Right?
book might not be around.
We'll have to delve deep into the
But if
Amazon to
somebody's
see if we can
interested,
find it.
next time we are in the lodge, I'll be glad to bring it in.